Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's tale begins, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And if you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. Now, close your eyes, get comfortable, and let's drift into the unknown together. This is one of those stories that feels almost unreal, even when it comes from people you trust completely. It doesn't feel like a story someone should be able to tell casually, and yet my parents carried it with them for decades before really talking about it. When they finally did, it changed the way I thought about chance, danger, and how close people can come to disaster without ever knowing it at the time. The year was 1976. My parents were teenagers then, young and in love, living in New York during a time that was anything but calm. The city was rough in those years. Crime was high, fear was everywhere, and people learned to be alert in ways that are hard to imagine now. Even so, teenagers were still teenagers. They still wanted privacy. They still wanted moments that felt normal and romantic, away from parents and noise and responsibilities. One of the places young couples went back then was Orchard Beach in the Bronx. It had a reputation as a kind of lover's lane. People would park their cars, sit together, talk, listen to music, and enjoy the feeling of being alone while still being surrounded by the city. It wasn't truly isolated, but it felt private enough, especially at night. That's where my parents were parked one evening. They were sitting in the car, talking and enjoying each other's company, not doing anything unusual, just two teenagers spending time together. Nothing about the night felt wrong at first. The area was familiar. Other cars were parked nearby. The atmosphere felt calm, or at least calm enough for two young people who thought they understood the risks of the city. But my mother started to feel uneasy. She has always described it as a strange feeling that came out of nowhere. Not a sound, not a movement, just a sudden sense that something wasn't right. At the time, she didn't have a logical explanation for it. There was no obvious threat, but something in her gut told her to pay attention. Instead of brushing it off, she listened to that feeling. She reached up and adjusted the rearview mirror, and that's when she saw him. A man was approaching their car, not just walking by, not heading somewhere else. He was moving toward them close enough that it was clear he was watching them, peeping, observing. His focus was on the inside of the car, on them. That moment changed everything. Fear hit immediately. The kind of fear that doesn't come with screaming or panic at first, but with a cold realization that you might be in danger. My mother alerted my father, telling him someone was there. They both looked again and confirmed what she had seen. The man was close. Too close. My father reacted instantly. He had a gun under the seat. Back then, it wasn't unheard of, especially in New York in the mid-1970s. People carried weapons because they felt they had to. The city was dangerous, and many believed the police couldn't always get there in time. My father grabbed the gun, jumped out of the car, and started yelling. He didn't hesitate. He didn't try to reason. He screamed at the man, making it very clear that he was armed and not afraid to use the weapon. His goal wasn't to confront or capture the man. It was to scare him away and protect my mother. The man backed off. My father chased him, shouting, until the man reached his own car. The guy got in and drove away quickly. It wasn't a prolonged encounter, but it was intense. Long enough for both of my parents to get a clear look at him. Long enough to notice the make of his car. long enough for the image to burn into their memory. After he left, my parents were shaken. They didn't stay there. The mood was gone. Any sense of romance or relaxation vanished completely. They left the area, adrenaline still pumping, hearts racing, trying to process what had just happened. At the time, they didn't know who the man was. They only knew that something bad might have happened if my mother hadn't trusted her instincts, or if my father hadn't reacted so quickly. For a while, it was just a scary story they shared between themselves. Then the news began to unfold. Over the following months, New York was gripped by fear as reports emerged about a serial killer targeting young couples. The attacks were random, brutal, and terrifying. People were shot in parked cars. Victims were found in places just like Orchard Beach. The city lived in constant anxiety, especially young people who fit the killer's pattern. When the suspect was finally identified and arrested, my parents were stunned. The man they had seen that night, the one my father chased off with a gun, was David Berkowitz, later known as the son of Sam. The realization hit them hard. Suddenly, that strange encounter took on a completely different meaning. This wasn't just a peeping Tom or a random creep. This was someone who would go on to murder multiple people, someone who specifically targeted couples parked in cars, someone who used a gun. They replayed that night over and over in their minds. What if my mother hadn't felt uneasy? What if she hadn't adjusted the mirror? What if my father hadn't had the gun? What if he had hesitated for even a few seconds? The possibilities are horrifying. What makes this story even more chilling is that my parents knew two of Berkowitz's victims. Not personally close, but close enough that they were real people to them, not just names on the news. Faces, stories, lives cut short. That connection made everything feel even more real, even more personal. For a long time, my parents didn't talk about their encounter much. Part of it was probably shock. Part of it was fear. And part of it was that they didn't fully grasp the significance until much later, when time and distance allowed them to reflect on it. When you're young, you move forward. You don't always stop to unpack trauma. You push it down and keep living. It wasn't until years later, when they were older, that they really talked about how close they had come to something unimaginable. By then, they had children, a family, a whole life built on moments that could have never existed. That's the part that blows my mind. The idea that my existence, and the existence of my siblings, if I have any, might hinge on a single decision to adjust a mirror, a single moment of intuition, a single act of aggression meant to scare someone away. It's terrifying to think how easily that night could have ended differently. Berkowitz was known for approaching cars quietly, for striking suddenly, for using surprise and fear to his advantage. If my parents had been distracted, if they had assumed it was nothing, if they had ignored that feeling, they might not have had time to react. They might have been shot. They might have been injured. They might have been murdered. Instead, they lived. This story changed how I think about instincts, about listening to that inner voice that tells you something isn't right, even when you can't explain why. My mother didn't have evidence. She didn't hear footsteps or see movement at first. She just felt something was wrong, and she acted on it. That decision likely saved their lives. It also changed how I think about randomness, about how close danger can be without us realizing it. My parents didn't know they were crossing paths with one of the most notorious serial killers in American history. To them, it was just a creepy guy near their car. But in reality, they were inches away from becoming another headline, another set of names, another tragedy. What's especially haunting is that Berkowitz didn't look like a monster. He looked like a normal man. Ordinary, someone you wouldn't necessarily notice in a crowd. Someone who could approach a car without immediately triggering alarm. That's part of what made him so dangerous. He blended in. It makes you realize how vulnerable people can be in moments when they think they're safe. Sitting in a parked car, laughing, talking, sharing a private moment. Those are the exact moments predators exploit. I don't believe my parents had any reason to lie about this. They didn't gain anything from telling me. They didn't dramatize it. They told it calmly, almost matter-of-factly, as something that happened a long time ago but still lingered in their memory. The details matched what is known about Berkowitz's behavior and locations. And the fact that they knew two of his victims makes the story even more grounded in reality. For me, it's not just a scary story. It's a reminder. A reminder that danger doesn't always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it creeps up quietly, waiting for a moment of distraction. A reminder that intuition matters, that paying attention can save lives, and that sometimes survival comes down to a handful of seconds and a few small choices. When I think about that night, I imagine my parents as teenagers, unaware of the significance of what they were about to experience. I imagine my mother's hand adjusting the mirror, my father jumping out of the car, the man retreating. A chain of events that ended not with gunshots, but with a car driving away. And then I imagine the alternate version. The version where that man doesn't retreat, where he pulls a gun first, where there's no chance to react, where my parents become part of a pattern of violence that haunted New York City. That version of the story doesn't exist, and that's the most chilling part of all. So much of life is built on moments like that. Moments we don't even realize are turning points until years later. Moments where danger brushes past us, close enough to feel its breath, and then moves on. My parents lived their lives after that night. They grew up. They built a family. They carried this story quietly in the background, a reminder of how close they came to something horrific. And every time I think about it, it sends a shiver through me. Because sometimes the scariest stories aren't about what happened. They're about what almost did. I still think about this whenever I see kids wandering around on their own, especially in places that are loud, crowded, and confusing. What happened to me didn't involve violence or crime, but it scared me deeply because of how close it came to being something much worse. It showed me just how thin the line can be between a normal night and something that could ruin lives. I've always looked younger than I actually am. Even now, people usually guess I'm a lot younger than my real age. Back then, it was even more noticeable. I was 19 at the time, but I could easily pass for 15 or 16. I didn't think much of it. It was just one of those things people joked about. One evening, I went to a carnival. It was the kind of local carnival that pops up for a short time, full of flashing lights, loud music, rides, games, food stands, and people everywhere. It was busy, chaotic, and exciting in that overstimulating way carnivals always are. I wasn't in the best headspace emotionally. The person I was supposed to be there with, my boyfriend at the time, had basically ditched me. I found myself alone in a crowded place, feeling awkward and a little embarrassed, but trying to make the best of it. I started doing what people often do when they're alone in public spaces like that. I wandered. I talked to random people in line. I tried to enjoy the rides and the atmosphere without thinking too hard about the fact that I was by myself. That's when I met them. Two girls came up to me and started talking like it was the most natural thing in the world. They were dressed in heavy makeup, heels, and clothes that made them look much older than they actually were. At the time, I didn't know that. There were no obvious adults with them, no parents hovering nearby, no one calling out to them or checking on them. Everything about their appearance and behavior screamed older teenagers or even young adults. They were friendly, confident, comfortable talking to a stranger. They asked if they could hang out with me, and since I was alone and already feeling a bit ditched, I said yes without really thinking it through. We walked around together. They followed me from place to place. We talked casually. We rode a couple of rides together. Nothing about it felt threatening or strange at first. Looking back now, that's what scares me the most. How normal it felt. We were just chatting about random things, school, life, complaints that felt relatable. And then the first red flag appeared, but I didn't recognize it immediately. One of them said something like, "I hate tests. I'm not ready for the test this week." I didn't think much of it at first. I was in college at the time, and tests were a big part of my life. Everyone complains about tests. It felt relatable on the surface. But something about the way she said it felt off. Not wrong enough to alarm me yet, just slightly younger somehow. Then came the second red flag, the one that made my stomach drop. She said, "Mom said if I pass my test, she'll let me come back next week." That sentence hit differently. In my head, I tried to rationalize it for a moment. Some people live with their parents. Some parents are strict. But the way she said it, the tone, the casual mention of needing permission, it didn't line up with the image I had formed of them in my head. That's when I finally stopped and asked the question I should have asked much earlier. "How old are you guys?" Even asking it felt weird because everything about them looked adult. The makeup, the clothes, the confidence. I genuinely expected them to say 18, maybe 17 at the youngest. They looked at each other and then said, "We're 13. I felt like my heart dropped straight into my stomach. My entire body went cold. My brain went into panic mode. Suddenly, everything replayed itself in my head at once. The walking around, the rides, the casual conversations, the fact that I was an adult hanging out with minors without knowing it. I immediately apologized. I told them I didn't know. I told them we couldn't hang out anymore. I tried to be calm, but inside I was terrified. Not just for myself, but for them. What shocked me even more was their reaction. They didn't understand why it was a problem. They literally asked me why we couldn't keep hanging out. I explained that I was too old, that it wasn't appropriate, that it wasn't safe. They brushed it off like it didn't matter. They told me it was fine. They said things like, "It doesn't matter. Come and hang with us," and tried to keep following me around. They became visibly upset when I insisted on separating and walking away. That moment still makes my skin crawl. Not because they did anything wrong intentionally. They were kids. They didn't understand the danger. That's exactly what terrified me. They were so comfortable following a stranger, so willing to stay with someone they had just met, so unaware of how easily that situation could have gone horribly wrong. Had I been someone with bad intentions, that night could have ended very differently. I didn't lure them. I didn't pressure them. I didn't try to isolate them, and still, they were ready to follow me anywhere. Ride after ride, place after place. No questions, no fear, no hesitation. It made me realize how easy it could be for the wrong person. This wasn't some dark alley. This was a public carnival full of people, noise, and lights. And even there, in a place that felt safe, two 13-year-old girls were comfortable attaching themselves to an adult stranger and didn't see a problem with it. That thought haunted me long after I left. Later on, this memory came back even stronger when I thought about a child I know personally, someone I've seen grow up. She's 7 years old. Her parent genuinely believes that children love their mommies, they don't wander off, and because of that belief, they haven't taught her stranger danger at all. And the truth is terrifying. This child will walk away with strangers without hesitation. She will approach random adults, even groups of men, and talk to them like she's known them forever. She has no fear, no sense of caution, no understanding that not everyone is safe. Watching that as an adult is deeply unsettling. People often assume that danger is obvious, that bad people look bad, that children will instinctively know when something is wrong. But that isn't how it works. Predators don't look like monsters. They don't announce themselves. They rely on trust, confusion, and politeness. They rely on children being taught to obey adults, to be friendly, to not make a scene. They rely on moments exactly like the one I experienced. If I hadn't asked that question, if I hadn't picked up on those red flags, I could have unknowingly put myself and them in danger. And if someone else, someone without good intentions, had been there instead of me, those girls could have been hurt. What scares me is how easily it could have happened without force, threats, or fear. Just friendliness, just familiarity, just a child assuming an adult is safe because they seem nice. That's why this story matters to me. It isn't about blaming kids. It isn't about paranoia. It's about awareness. Children don't have the life experience to judge risk. They don't understand consequences. They don't see the world the way adults do. That's why teaching them matters. Stranger danger doesn't mean teaching kids to fear everyone. It means teaching them boundaries, teaching them that adults should not ask them to go places alone, teaching them that it's okay to say no, teaching them that being polite is not more important than being safe. And it means adults need to be aware too. We live in a world where people assume public places are safe by default. Carnivals, malls, parks, neighborhoods. But safety isn't automatic. It's created through awareness, communication, and responsibility. I walked away from that night shaken, but ultimately unharmed. Those girls walked away too, probably annoyed, probably confused, maybe even thinking I was being dramatic. But I walked away with a lesson I'll never forget. There are good people out there, truly. Most people aren't dangerous. Most strangers mean no harm. But the problem is that you only need one bad person for something terrible to happen. And bad people don't announce themselves. They blend in. They wait for moments of trust. They count on naivety. That night showed me how fragile safety can be, especially for kids. It showed me how easily a normal situation can turn into something dangerous without anyone realizing it in time. So when I say don't trust strangers, I don't mean live in fear. I mean be careful. Teach kids to question. Teach them to stay close. Teach them that it's okay to walk away. Because sometimes the scariest part isn't what happened. It's what almost could have. This is one of those stories that feels disturbing, not because of gore or sudden violence, but because of how close it was, how hidden it was, and how long went unnoticed. It's the kind of thing that makes you question how well you really know the people around you, even the ones who feel familiar and safe. My parents were very close friends with a neighbor and her family. They lived nearby. And our families spent a lot of time together. This wasn't a casual acquaintance or a passing friendship. These were the kind of neighbors you trusted, the kind you talked to regularly, shared meals with, watched kids grow up with. Their home felt like an extension of the neighborhood's sense of safety. They were a family of 4, living in an apartment that wasn't very big but was managed in a practical way. To help with expenses, they rented out 2 of the rooms to people they already knew. That part is important. These weren't strangers pulled in off the street. These were people they trusted enough to live under the same roof with their children. One of the rooms was rented to a very religious woman. She kept to herself, followed strict routines, and didn't really cause any concern. The other room was occupied by the neighbor's childhood friend. He had known the family for years, practically since they were kids. That kind of history builds a sense of trust that's hard to shake. When someone has been around that long, you stop questioning them. He was in his early 30s at the time. By most people's standards, he was quite handsome. He took care of himself, dressed well, and didn't stand out in a negative way. If anything, he blended in too well. The most noticeable thing about him was how reserved he was. He wasn't loud. He wasn't social in an obvious way. He didn't cause drama. He mostly kept to himself. At the time, that reserve was seen as a personality trait. Some people are quiet. Some people are introverted. Not everyone needs to be outgoing. No one thought it was strange or suspicious. In fact, it probably made him seem safer. He wasn't intrusive. He didn't push boundaries in obvious ways. He existed quietly in the background of their lives. That's what made what happened later so shocking. One night, everything changed with a single phone call. I remember how different my parents' tone became when they answered the phone. It wasn't a normal conversation. There was panic immediately. On the other end of the line was our neighbor, and she was hysterical, crying, I barely able to speak clearly, struggling to get the words out. Something terrible had just happened, and she didn't even know how to process it yet. She told my parents that there had been a knock at their apartment door. It wasn't late enough to be suspicious, but it wasn't a normal visit either. When they opened the door, they were met by 2 police officers and 2 detectives. Standing right behind them was the neighbor's childhood friend, the man who rented the room in their apartment. The officers immediately handcuffed him. Imagine that moment. Opening your door, expecting maybe a delivery or a neighbor, and instead watching someone you've known most of your life being restrained by police in your own home. The shock alone must have been overwhelming. At first, no one fully understood what was happening. The neighbor was confused. I'm terrified, asking questions that weren't being answered yet. The children were there. Her daughters were there. Everything was happening too fast. The police didn't take him away quietly. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't something minor. This was serious. After the investigation began, the truth came out, and it was worse than anyone could have imagined. Her childhood friend, the quiet, reserved man living under the same roof as her family, was a pedophile. The police had been investigating him for some time. They had found evidence that left no room for doubt. Hidden cameras had been installed in the apartment's bathroom. Small, carefully placed cameras that were easy to miss unless you knew exactly what you were looking for. They were positioned to capture the most private moments imaginable. Those cameras were connected directly to his computer. When the police searched his devices, they found images and videos, footage of the neighbor's daughters, private, violating recordings taken inside what should have been the safest place in their lives. There were also other materials, things that made it clear this wasn't an isolated incident or a momentary lapse. This was something he had been doing deliberately, secretly, and for a long time. The sense of betrayal was unimaginable. This wasn't someone breaking into a home. This wasn't an outsider lurking in the dark. This was someone invited in, someone trusted, someone who shared meals with the family, passed them in the hallway, lived alongside them as if nothing was wrong. To make matters even worse, the investigation revealed that he had developed an obsession with the neighbor's oldest daughter. She was a minor. That detail alone changes everything. It turns an already horrific situation into something deeply terrifying. This wasn't just voyeurism. This wasn't just illegal surveillance. There was fixation, intent, a pattern of thought that suggested escalation. When you realize that someone living in your home is not only violating your children's privacy, but also becoming obsessed with one of them, the fear goes beyond anger or shock. It becomes primal, protective, overwhelming. The family was shattered. The neighbor blamed herself. She questioned every decision she had made, letting him live there, trusting him, not noticing the signs. Parents often do this when something like this happens, even when the fault lies entirely with the person who committed the crime. Guilt finds a way to attach itself. The daughters were traumatized in ways that are hard to put into words. Their sense of safety was destroyed. The bathroom, a place meant for privacy, became a source of fear. Their home no longer felt like home. Every memory was now tainted by the knowledge that someone had been watching them without their consent. And then there was the wider impact. Neighbors were stunned. Friends were horrified. People who had known him casually couldn't reconcile the person they thought they knew with what he had done. That's one of the most disturbing aspects of cases like this. There's rarely a clear warning sign that everyone can point to afterward. The person doesn't fit the stereotype people expect. He wasn't aggressive. He wasn't openly inappropriate. He wasn't socially awkward in a way that raised alarms. He was quiet, polite, reserved. And that made it easier for him to hide. The apartment was searched thoroughly. The cameras were removed. The computer and other devices were taken as evidence. Police statements were given. Social services became involved. The legal process began slow and exhausting. For the family, life was split into before and after. Before, there was trust. After, there was fear. Before, the childhood friend was part of their history. After, his name became something they didn't want to say out loud. What makes this story linger in my mind is how ordinary it all seemed until it wasn't. This didn't happen in a dark alley or a dangerous neighborhood. It happened in a home full of people who believed they were safe because they were surrounded by familiarity. It's terrifying to realize how easily predators can hide in plain sight when they are patient and careful. The neighbor's decision to rent rooms only to people she knew was meant to be protective. She wasn't careless. She wasn't reckless. She thought she was doing the right thing. And still, it happened. That's what makes this story so unsettling. It removes the comforting illusion that danger only comes from strangers. Sometimes it comes from people with shared childhoods, shared memories, shared trust. After everything came out, there was a lot of anger. Toward him, obviously, but also toward the situation, toward the realization that something like this could be happening silently, right under everyone's noses. The legal consequences were severe, as they should have been. But no punishment could undo what had already been done. No sentence could erase the images from those girls' minds or restore their sense of safety overnight. Healing, if it came at all, took time. This story spread quietly among people who knew the family, not as gossip, but as something spoken about in hushed tones. People were careful with their words, careful not to re-traumatize, careful not to speculate. But the fear lingered. Parents became more vigilant, more suspicious, more aware of how vulnerable children can be even in familiar environments. It changed the way people thought about trust, about privacy, about who they allowed into their homes. For me, this story reshaped how I think about evil. It isn't always loud. It isn't always obvious. Sometimes it's quiet, and polite, and hidden behind a friendly face and a shared history. The neighbor's family eventually moved. They couldn't stay in that apartment. Too many memories, too much pain tied to the walls. Starting over somewhere else was the only way forward. But even then, you don't really leave something like that behind. You carry it with you, in caution, in fear, in the way you look at people differently than you did before. This wasn't just a crime. It was a violation of trust at the deepest level. A reminder that familiarity is not the same as safety, and that some of the most dangerous people are the ones who work the hardest to seem harmless. It was a mess, a devastating, life-altering mess, and the kind of story that stays with you long after you hear it, because it forces you to confront an uncomfortable truth. Sometimes the person you least suspect is the one doing the most harm, quietly, patiently, right under everyone's roof. In March of 1922, on a small and isolated farmstead in rural Germany, something happened that would later be described as one of the most disturbing, unsolved crimes in the country's history. At the time, the place looked ordinary enough. A working farm, surrounded by fields and trees, far from the noise of cities. It was the kind of place where days blended together, where life followed a predictable rhythm shaped by animals, weather, and hard work. 6 people lived on that farm. There were the 2 parents who owned and worked the land. Their adult daughter lived there as well, along with her young child, a 7-year-old girl. Helping them was a maid who had only just arrived, and her own 2-year-old child. It was a full house, busy, noisy at times, but nothing about it stood out as unusual to outsiders. But in the days leading up to the murders, strange things began to happen. It started with small details, the kind that are easy to dismiss at first. Footprints appeared in the snow behind the house. They led toward the back door, but there were no matching footprints leading away. It was as if someone had come onto the property and never left. The family noticed, but no one could explain it. They assumed it might have been an animal or maybe a trick of the light and snow. Then keys began to go missing. House keys, tools, things that should have been exactly where they were left. At first, it was annoying, but not alarming. On a working farm, things get misplaced all the time. But over time, it became harder to explain. The missing items never turned up again. There were also noises. Sounds coming from the attic late at night. Footsteps, shifting. The quiet creak of movement above their heads. Anyone who has lived in an old house knows how easily the building itself can make noise. Wood expands and contracts. Animals can get inside walls. Wind can make even solid structures sound alive. Still, the noises didn't stop. The previous live-in maid became increasingly frightened. She told others that the house felt wrong, that it was haunted, that something was there that shouldn't be. Eventually, she couldn't take it anymore and left the job, abandoning the farm entirely. To most people, this only added to the strange reputation of the place, but it still wasn't enough to make anyone suspect what was really happening. Then a new maid arrived. The day of the murders was her very first day on the farm. That night, sometime after darkness fell and the farm settled into silence, the killing began. Investigators later believed that the victims were lured into the barn one by one. The barn was close to the house, familiar, a place they visited countless times each day. Nothing about going there would have felt dangerous. Perhaps someone called out to them. Perhaps they heard a noise and went to investigate. However it happened, they entered the barn separately, unaware of what was waiting for them inside. There, they were attacked with a mattock, a heavy farm tool similar to a hand axe. The blows were brutal and deliberate. One by one, each person was beaten to death. Afterward, their bodies were stacked on top of one another in the barn, as if they were nothing more than objects. Among them was the 7-year-old child. What makes this part of the crime especially horrifying is that the child did not die immediately. Evidence suggested that she survived the first attack. She was conscious, aware. Investigators later discovered clumps of her own hair torn from her scalp, a sign of extreme pain, fear, and distress. This led them to believe that she was alive long enough to witness what was happening around her. She watched as members of her family were killed. She watched their bodies thrown onto her. And she endured it until she finally succumbed to her injuries. Inside the house, the violence continued. The maid and her 2-year-old child were still asleep in their beds. They never had a chance to run or defend themselves. They were murdered quietly where they lay, ending the lives of 2 people who had only just arrived at the farm and had no idea of the danger they were stepping into. By the time the killing was over, 6 people were dead. What happened next is what truly unsettled everyone who later learned the details. The murders were not discovered right away. In fact, no one suspected anything was wrong for days. Neighbors noticed smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney. The animals were fed. The livestock was cared for as usual. Everything appeared normal. From the outside, life on the farm seemed to continue just as it always had. Investigators later realized what this meant. Whoever committed the murders did not leave. They stayed in the house. For 3 days after the killings, someone lived among the bodies. They kept the fire going. They fed the animals. They moved around the property as if nothing had happened. Neighbors saw no signs of panic or distress. No one heard screams. No one reported strange behavior. The killer may have slept in the same rooms where the victims lay dead. Eventually, suspicion grew when members of the community realized no one from the family had been seen or heard from in several days. When people finally went to investigate, what they found was beyond anything they could have imagined. The discovery of the bodies shocked the entire region. The brutality of the crime, the methodical nature of the killings, and the strange events leading up to them left investigators deeply disturbed. The idea that someone had been living in the house afterward made it even worse. Despite an extensive investigation, the crime was never solved. There were theories, of course, many of them. Some believed the killer had been living in the attic all along, explaining the footprints, the missing keys, and the noises at night. Others suspected someone known to the family, someone familiar enough with the farm to move freely without raising suspicion. There were rumors of family conflicts, personal grudges, and hidden secrets. None of them could be proven. No suspect was ever convicted. No confession ever surfaced. Over time, the farm became a symbol of unease, a place people spoke about in hushed voices. The details were passed down, retold, reshaped by fear and memory. The idea of someone watching from the attic, waiting, listening, became almost as terrifying as the murders themselves. What stays with people most is not just the violence, but the silence around it. The fact that life went on for days afterward. That smoke rose from the chimney while 6 bodies lay nearby. That neighbors saw signs of normalcy and never imagined the truth. It forces you to confront an uncomfortable thought. That sometimes the worst horrors don't announce themselves. They don't come with screams or chaos. Sometimes they sit quietly, hiding behind routine, blending into the background until it's far too late. Even now, more than a century later, the case remains unsolved. The victims never received justice. The questions were never answered. And the farm, though long gone, still lives on in the collective memory as a place where something unimaginably dark once took root. It is remembered not just for the crime itself, but for the chilling reminder it leaves behind. That evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary day, an ordinary house, and smoke rising calmly from a chimney while something unspeakable waits inside. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. This is one of those stories that never really leaves you once you learn about it. Not because it's shocking in a sensational way, but because of how random it was, how contained it was, and how close it came to intersecting with ordinary lives. It's the kind of story that makes you realize how thin the barrier is between normalcy and absolute horror, and how little control we actually have over the spaces we assume are safe. It happened on July 30th, 2008, on a Greyhound bus traveling through Manitoba, Canada. The stretch of road was about 30 kilometers west of Portage-la-Prairie, a quiet, unremarkable area that most people would never give a second thought. Long highways, flat land, fields stretching out on either side. Kind of place you pass through without noticing, half asleep, watching the scenery blur past your window. Greyhound buses are strange spaces. They're public, but also intimate in an uncomfortable way. You're sitting inches from strangers, sharing air, sounds, and silence for hours at a time. People bring their lives onto the bus with them. Exhaustion, anxiety, excitement, boredom. Most passengers keep to themselves. Some listen to music, some sleep. Some stare out the window and let their thoughts drift. That night, Tim McLean was one of those passengers. He was just traveling, not causing trouble, not interacting much with anyone. At some point during the trip, a man named Vince Lee sat beside him. There was nothing immediately alarming about this. People switched seats all the time. Strangers sit next to each other constantly on buses. No one expects danger from that simple act. Then, without warning, everything changed. Vince Lee pulled out a knife and began stabbing Tim McLean repeatedly. There was no argument, no build-up that other passengers noticed, no warning signs that people could react to in time. It was sudden, violent, and completely unexpected. The confined space of the bus made it even more terrifying. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and for a few horrifying moments, chaos broke out as people realized what was happening. The driver pulled the bus over as quickly as possible. Passengers fled. People poured out onto the side of the highway, some screaming, some crying, some frozen in shock. They stood there in the dark, on the edge of the road, watching something they couldn't fully process. Watching a nightmare unfold inside a place that just minutes earlier had felt boring and safe. Inside the bus, the attack continued. Tim McLean, was killed. And even after his death, the violence did not stop. As the other passengers stood outside, horrified and helpless, Vince Lee proceeded to behead Tim. He then held the severed head up to the bus windows, showing it to the people outside. Not in panic, not in confusion, but in a way that witnesses later described as almost triumphant. That image alone is enough to haunt anyone who hears about it. But the story doesn't end there. Police were called immediately. The RCMP arrived on the scene, surrounding the bus, but they did not rush in. The situation was unstable and extremely dangerous. They had no way of knowing what Lee might do next, whether he had more weapons or whether there were explosives involved. They had to proceed carefully. For the next 4.5 hours, the bus remained sealed off. And inside that bus, Vince Lee paced back and forth. He continued to defile Tim McLean's body. He mutilated it. He cannibalized parts of it. All while law enforcement waited outside, unable to intervene without risking further loss of life. 4.5 hours is a long time. It's long enough for fear to stretch into something else entirely. Long enough for shock to harden into trauma. Long enough for the passengers standing outside, many of them stranded in the middle of nowhere, to replay what they had just witnessed over and over in their minds. Eventually, around 1:30 in the morning, Lee attempted to escape through a bus window. At that point, police moved in and arrested him. The immediate aftermath was exactly what you'd expect. The story exploded across the news. People were horrified, confused, angry. My Greyhound travel suddenly felt unsafe to many. Passengers who had been on that bus were deeply traumatized. Some would later say they could still smell the bus, still hear the sounds, still see the windows in their dreams. But the part of the story that disturbed many people even more came later. Vince Lee was found not guilty by reason of insanity. During evaluations, it was determined that he was suffering from severe mental illness. He claimed that God had told him to commit the act, that voices had instructed him, that he believed he was fighting evil. In the eyes of the law, he was not criminally responsible for what he had done. Instead of prison, he was sent to a high-security mental health facility. That decision was, and still is, deeply controversial. Many people struggled to accept it. For the family of Tim McLean, it felt like justice had slipped through their fingers. For the public, it raised terrifying questions about safety, mental health, and accountability. And then, years later, it happened again. In May of 2015, Vince Lee was released. After treatment, evaluations, and legal processes, he was deemed no longer a threat to the public. He was allowed to re-enter society. He was given a new name. His identity was protected. He was free to live a life again. That fact alone is enough to unsettle almost anyone who hears the story. The idea that someone capable of such extreme violence could simply be out there, walking around, shopping for groceries, sitting on buses, existing among other people who will never know who he is or what he did. But for me, the most disturbing part of the story isn't even the violence itself. It's the proximity. Because my mom, my brother, and I were on a Greyhound bus in that exact area of Manitoba around that same time. Not on that bus, not with those people, but close enough that when I think about it, my stomach tightens. We could have been there. We could have been on that route, sitting in similar seats, looking out similar windows, sharing space with strangers we didn't know, assuming, like everyone else, that a bus ride was just a bus ride. That realization is what truly unsettled me. It's one thing to read about something horrific that happened far away, in another country, in a different context. It's another thing entirely to realize that you and your family were moving through the same physical space. At the same time, unaware of how close you were to something that would become one of the most infamous crimes in Canadian history. It forces you to confront how random survival can be. There was nothing special that protected us, no decision we made that kept us safe. We were just elsewhere, by chance. Minutes or kilometers can mean the difference between a normal memory and lifelong trauma. I think about the passengers on that bus a lot. How many of them were just trying to get home? How many were students, workers, travelers? How many of them sat down that night expecting nothing more than boredom and sleep? How many of them will never ride a bus again? I think about the driver, forced to watch this unfold, and then make split-second decisions under unimaginable pressure. I think about the police officers, standing outside for hours, knowing what was happening inside and having to wait. And of course, I think about Tim McLean, a young man who didn't get to choose any of this, who sat down next to a stranger and lost his life in one of the most horrifying ways imaginable. A family that lost a son, a brother, a loved one, in a way that defies understanding. This story also raises uncomfortable questions that don't have easy answers. How do we balance compassion for mental illness with accountability for harm? How do we protect the public while respecting human rights? How do families of victims find peace when the person responsible is not punished in a traditional sense? There are no satisfying conclusions here. What lingers most is the randomness of it all. The idea that safety is often an illusion built on routine and expectation. We assume that certain places are safe because they usually are. Buses, trains, planes, public spaces. Most of the time they are. Yeah, but sometimes something slips through. And when it does, the consequences are catastrophic. Whenever I think back to being on that Greyhound bus with my mom and brother, I feel a strange mix of gratitude and unease. Gratitude that nothing happened to us. Unease knowing that the only reason is chance. We like to believe that tragedy follows patterns, that danger can be predicted, that bad things happen for reasons we can understand. But this story shatters that illusion. It reminds you that sometimes horror sits quietly beside you, waiting for a moment no one can foresee. And that realization stays with you, long after the headlines fade, long after the road stretches on, long after the bus doors close behind you. I was at the gym late in the day, one of those long workouts where you lose track of time. Outside, a heavy storm had rolled in. Rain slammed against the windows and thunder cracked so loud that it rattled the glass and echoed through the building. Most of us barely paid attention to it. Storms like that weren't unusual. And when you're focused on your routine, everything else fades into the background. That was when I heard it. A sharp, dry sound cut through the low rumble of thunder. At first, it didn't even register as anything strange. It was quick and distant, and with the storm going on, my brain automatically filed it away as just another thunderclap. A few seconds later, I heard it again, and then a third time. I paused mid-rep and looked around. A few other people glanced up too, but no one seemed overly concerned. Someone even joked about the storm getting worse. The noise blended too well with the weather, and no alarms went off. No one screamed. No one ran. So everyone shrugged it off and went back to what they were doing. I tried to do the same, but something didn't sit right with me. The sounds were too sharp, too quick. Thunder rolls and lingers. These didn't. I stood there for a moment, listening to the rain pounding outside, my heart beating just a little faster than it should have been. I told myself I was being paranoid. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. After a minute or two, I decided to head down to the main level of the building. I wasn't even sure why. Maybe I just wanted to see outside, or maybe I wanted proof that I was wrong. As I moved through the stairwell, the storm sounded even louder, like the whole building was wrapped in noise. By the time I reached the main level, I heard more of those sharp sounds. 3 more, close together. This time, there was no mistaking it. They came from somewhere nearby, not from the sky. The noise echoed in a way thunder never does. My stomach dropped. I walked toward the front of the building and looked out through the glass doors. Across the street, there was a small mechanic shop. The rain was coming down hard, blurring everything, but I thought I saw a car pulling away fast, its headlights cutting through the gray curtain of water. The car disappeared almost immediately, swallowed by the storm. I stood there staring, trying to convince myself that I hadn't really seen anything. For a few seconds, I considered turning back, calling someone, doing nothing. That would have been the easiest choice. But the feeling in my chest wouldn't let me ignore it. Every instinct I had was telling me that something was very wrong. I crossed the street, rain soaking through my clothes in seconds. The mechanic shop door was partially open, the inside almost completely dark. No lights, no movement, just the sound of rain and distant thunder. I hesitated at the entrance, my hand hovering near the door, my mind screaming at me to leave. When I stepped inside, it felt like walking into another world. The noise of the storm dulled, replaced by heavy silence. The air smelled like oil and metal. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness. For a moment, I just stood there, frozen, my heart pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. That was when the fear really hit me. Not a sudden jolt, but a deep, crawling dread that started in my spine and spread through my body. It was the kind of feeling that tells you to get out now. Don't think. Don't question it. Just leave. My legs felt stiff, like they didn't belong to me anymore. I stayed like that until I heard a noise. It came from somewhere deeper inside the shop, from a small office area that was dimly lit. It sounded like something falling to the floor. A box, maybe. The noise was soft, but in the silence it felt incredibly loud. I swallowed hard and looked around for something, anything, to protect myself. My eyes landed on a metal pipe, leaning against the wall. I grabbed it, my hands slick with rain and sweat, and slowly moved toward the office. Each step felt heavy. The concrete floor was cold beneath my shoes, and the shadows seemed to stretch and move as I walked. I kept expecting someone to jump out at me or for another sound to break the silence, but nothing happened. When I reached the office door, everything went quiet again. No movement. No sound. I stood there, pipe raised, my breathing shallow. I pushed the door open slowly. The sight inside hit me all at once. The owner of the shop was lying on the floor. There was blood everywhere, pooling beneath his head and spreading across the concrete. For a second, my brain refused to understand what I was seeing. It didn't feel real, like a scene from a movie that hadn't fully loaded yet. Then the smell reached me. A metallic, sickening smell that made my stomach turn. I panicked. My hands started shaking so badly I almost dropped the pipe. I rushed forward and knelt beside him, calling out, even though I already knew he wasn't going to answer. His eyes were open, staring at nothing. I pulled out my phone and called the police, my voice breaking as I tried to explain where I was and what I'd found. The operator kept asking me to stay calm, to answer questions, to help if I could. I tore off my towel from the gym bag I'd dropped earlier and pressed it against his head, trying to stop the bleeding. My hands were covered in blood almost immediately. I told myself to keep going, to do something, anything. When I gently tilted his head to see where the wound was, the truth hit me in the worst way possible. He had been shot in the head. The entry point was partially hidden by his hair, but it was clear enough. There was nothing I could do. No amount of pressure, no first aid, no quick thinking would change that. I sat back, my hands shaking uncontrollably, my mind racing. Time stretched out in a way I had never experienced before. Every second felt heavy, thick, like it was dragging itself forward. The police and the ambulance took about 30 minutes to arrive, but it felt like hours. I remember pacing, sitting, standing again. I remember staring at the door, half expecting someone to come back through it. Every sound outside made me jump. When they finally arrived, the shop filled with flashing lights and voices. They took over, asking me questions, guiding me outside, wrapping a blanket around my shoulders even though I wasn't cold anymore. I gave my statement over and over, trying to piece together what I'd heard and seen. Later, long after everything was done, the reality of it all settled in. I kept replaying the moment in the gym, those first sounds that everyone, including me, had ignored. I thought about how close I had been, how easily I could have walked away and never known what happened inside that shop. Even now, I can still hear those sounds in my head. Sharp, final. They don't sound like thunder anymore. And every time a storm rolls in, I'm right back there, standing in the dark, wishing I had never heard them at all. This is one of those moments in life that feels ordinary right up until it suddenly isn't. And once it changes, it never fully changes back. Even now when I think about it, I can still feel the atmosphere of that day in my body. Like my nerves remember it better than my mind ever could. I was at a gym during a storm. A real storm. The kind where the rain comes down so hard it blurs the world outside the windows and thunder rolls so loudly that it shakes the building. Inside, everything felt normal. People were working out, music was playing, weights were clanking, and the storm outside was just background noise. When I heard the first gunshot, I didn't recognize it as a gunshot. Neither did anyone else. It blended perfectly with the thunder. Then there was another one, and another. A few people looked around, but no one panicked. Someone even laughed it off, saying it was just the storm. Thunder can sound sharp, explosive, sudden. Your brain wants to believe the safest explanation, especially when you're in a place that feels controlled and familiar. I tried to tell myself the same thing, but something about it didn't sit right with me. I decided to go down to the main level of the building, mostly out of curiosity, partly because I couldn't focus anymore. As I was moving, I heard 3 more loud cracks. This time, they didn't sound like thunder. They sounded closer, heavier, more deliberate. Still, my brain hesitated to accept what they really were. As I reached the lower level, I noticed movement outside through the rain. I thought I saw a car leaving in a hurry near a mechanic shop next door. And it was hard to tell for sure because the rain was coming down so hard it turned everything into shadows and streaks of light. I stood there for a second trying to piece together what I was seeing and hearing, feeling uneasy but not fully understanding why. I walked into the mechanic shop. I don't know what I expected to find. Maybe nothing. Maybe someone sheltering from the rain. Maybe I thought I was being silly and would laugh at myself afterward. The moment I stepped inside, though, something changed. The shop was dark. Not closed dark, but unnaturally dark, like the lights were off when they shouldn't have been. The air felt heavy, still, wrong. I felt a chill run straight up my spine. It was a pure, instinctive feeling, the kind that hits before you have time to think. Every part of me screamed that I shouldn't be there, that I needed to leave immediately. I froze where I was, my heart pounding, listening to the sound of the rain on the roof and my own breathing in my ears. Then I heard a noise. It came from a poorly lit office area, deeper inside the shop. It sounded like something falling to the floor, maybe a box tipping over. The sound was small, but in that silence it felt enormous. I grabbed a metal pipe that was nearby without really thinking about it. My hands were shaking, but I forced myself to move toward the office, step by a slow step. The closer I got, the quieter everything became. No voices, no movement. Just the storm outside and the sound of my own footsteps. I stood in front of the office door for a moment, trying to steady myself. I remember thinking that whatever was on the other side of that door was going to change something forever. I opened it. The owner of the shop was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. For a second, my brain refused to process what I was seeing. It felt like my mind was trying to protect me by delaying reality. Then it hit all at once. The smell, the stillness, the way his body was positioned. Panic flooded through me so fast it made me dizzy. I called the police immediately, my voice barely steady enough to get the words out. While I was on the phone, I tried to do something, anything, because standing there felt unbearable. I grabbed towels and pressed them against his head, trying to stop the bleeding. I tilted his head gently, hoping against reason that there was still a chance. That's when I knew. The gunshot wound was hidden by his hair, but once I moved it, the truth was undeniable. There was nothing I could do. No amount of pressure, no position, no help I could give would change the outcome. The realization hit me like a physical blow. I remember apologizing out loud, even though I knew he couldn't hear me. The police and the ambulance arrived about 30 minutes later. Those 30 minutes felt endless, every second stretched out, heavy and unreal. I sat there, soaked, shaking, listening to the storm and replaying everything in my head. The sounds I had heard, the car I thought I saw, the moment I stepped inside the shop, the moment I opened that door. When help finally arrived, the space filled with lights, voices, radios crackling, boots on concrete. The scene became busy and loud, but none of it made the feeling go away. I gave my statement, I answered questions, I watched them work, even though I already knew the outcome. Long after it was over, I kept thinking about how easily I could have ignored it all. How close I was to staying upstairs and assuming it was just thunder. How random it felt that I was the one who walked into that shop at that moment. How thin the line was between a normal workout during a storm and standing in a dark room with a dead man. What stays with me the most isn't just the image, though that's hard enough. It's the silence before I open the door. That deep, instinctual warning that something was wrong. The way your body knows danger before your mind can catch up. And the knowledge that sometimes, even when you do everything you can, you arrive too late. That night stretched into my memory like a scar. I still hear thunder differently now. Loud bangs make my heart jump. And every time I pass a mechanic shop, especially on a rainy day, and I think about how ordinary everything felt right up until it wasn't, and how some moments divide your life into before and after without asking your permission. This is a story I hesitated to ever tell out loud because even now it feels unreal when I replay it in my head. Not unreal in a dreamlike way, but unreal in the sense that it doesn't feel like something that should exist in the same world as dorm rooms, college classes, and ordinary relationships. It's a story that sits uncomfortably between disbelief and memory. And for a long time, I tried to convince myself that parts of it must have been exaggerated by fear. But the emotional impact of it never faded. And that's how I know it was real to me in the moment, no matter how badly I wish it hadn't been. This happened in 2016, when I was in college and living in a dorm. I met a girl through a social circle that overlapped with mine, and from the beginning she stood out. She was intense in a way that was hard to define at first. Not loud or dramatic, but sharp, observant, and unpredictable. She spoke confidently about things most people our age didn't, and there was something about her that made it feel like she knew more about the world than she let on. We hit it off quickly, and that connection eventually turned into a relationship that would last about 16 months. Looking back, that length of time feels unbelievable, given everything that happened. But when you're inside something like that, your sense of normal gets distorted without you realizing it. The very first night I met her should have been the moment I walked away. We ended up back at my dorm room late that night. Nothing about it felt especially unusual at first. We were talking, laughing, getting to know each other in that excited, half-nervous way people do when something new is starting. Eventually, we got ready to go to sleep. That should have been the end of it. Instead, she casually said something that immediately put me on edge. She told me she knew how to access red rooms on the dark web. At the time, I had heard the term before, but only in the vague, almost myth-like way most people do. It's one of those things that floats around online discussions, half rumor, half urban legend. Even then, I didn't fully believe they were real in the way people described. I assumed she was exaggerating or trying to shock me. Before I could really react or ask questions, she pulled something up. I remember feeling confused more than anything at first. I didn't understand what I was looking at. The image quality was poor, grainy, like an old webcam feed. The room on the screen looked like an ordinary bedroom, which somehow made it worse. There was nothing theatrical or staged about it. No dramatic lighting, no props, just a room that could have been anywhere. And then I realized what was happening. What I watched over the next several minutes is something I will never fully forget, even though I've tried. I won't go into graphic detail because the specifics aren't necessary to understand how disturbing it was. What matters is this. I watched a man brutally murder another man, who I was told was his boyfriend. The victim was restrained and clearly incapacitated at first, possibly intoxicated or unconscious. As the violence began, it became obvious that he was not meant to survive. When he started to regain awareness, the sounds he made were human, in the most raw and horrifying way possible. Pain, fear, confusion, all mixed together. There was no performance aspect to it, no acting, no indication that this was staged. This wasn't a movie. It wasn't special effects. It was real suffering. I remember feeling frozen. My body didn't know how to react. Part of me wanted to look away, but another part of me couldn't process what I was seeing fast enough to move. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it. My stomach felt like it was folding in on itself. The part that still haunts me the most wasn't even the violence itself, as horrific as that was. It was the casualness of the person committing it, the lack of urgency, the lack of emotion, the way he moved as if this was something he had planned, something he had thought through. And then there was a moment involving a dog that pushed the whole thing into a level of psychological horror I still struggle to explain. The way the animal responded, without understanding, without hesitation, made the entire scene feel deeply wrong on a primal level. It shattered any remaining sense that this was just some elaborate hoax. I remember finally breaking down and telling her to turn it off. She did, almost reluctantly, like I was interrupting something she found interesting. I don't remember sleeping much that night. I don't remember feeling safe. My dorm room, which had always felt familiar and secure, suddenly felt contaminated. Like something dark had been invited in and didn't want to leave. What's difficult to explain is why I didn't immediately cut contact with her after that. The honest answer is that I was young, naive, and deeply unprepared for the kind of manipulation and instability that would follow. She downplayed what I had seen. She framed it as something shocking but distant, something that didn't really affect our lives. She normalized it in a way that made me doubt my own reaction. Over time, I learned that what I saw that night wasn't an isolated incident in her world. She had an obsession with dark content, not just curiosity, but fixation. Violence, suffering, and extreme material fascinated her. She spoke about it the way someone might talk about a niche hobby or an academic interest, detached and analytical, as if emotional reactions were something only less intelligent people experienced. As our relationship continued, her behavior became more troubling. She would threaten to kill me during arguments, not in a joking way, not with a laugh afterward. She would say it calmly, or sometimes in the middle of emotional outbursts, as if it were just another sentence. At the time, I didn't believe her. I told myself she was being dramatic, that she didn't mean it, that people say extreme things when they're upset. That was a mistake. One incident in particular still stands out as the moment I realized how dangerous the situation actually was. She was having a panic attack, intense and uncontrolled. I was trying to calm her down, doing what I thought was the right thing, staying close, speaking softly, telling her she was safe. Suddenly, she grabbed a box cutter. There was no warning, no escalation. One moment we were talking, and the next she was lunging toward me. Pure instinct took over. I grabbed her wrist, trying to push it away from my body. In the struggle, the blade ended up cutting into her leg instead. Oh, the shock of that moment snapped both of us out of whatever headspace we had been in. She screamed. I froze. Blood was everywhere. Not an overwhelming amount, but enough to make the situation terrifyingly real. This wasn't words anymore. This wasn't online videos or dark conversations. This was real violence, inches away from becoming something irreversible. Afterwards, she cried. She apologized. She said she hadn't meant it. She said she was scared and out of control. And once again, I convinced myself that it was a one-time thing, that she needed help, that I could be patient, that leaving would make things worse. That relationship was chaos from beginning to end. Living inside it felt like constantly walking on unstable ground, never knowing when it would give way. There were moments of calm, even moments of genuine affection, which made the bad times harder to reconcile. It's easier to leave someone who is consistently cruel than someone who swings between loving and terrifying. Eventually, the relationship ended, not in one dramatic explosion, but in a slow unraveling as the reality of what I was dealing with became impossible to ignore. Even now, years later, I sometimes think about that first night, about how casually she showed me something that shattered my understanding of how dark the world can be, about how easily I could have become a statistic if things had gone slightly differently, about how thin the line is between fascination and danger. What scares me the most isn't just that content like that exists somewhere in the shadows of the internet. It's that there are people who seek it out, normalize it, and carry that mindset into their real-world relationships. It's that someone capable of watching that kind of suffering without flinching can sit next to you, date you, sleep in the same bed as you, and smile like everything's fine. I don't tell this story to shock people. I tell it because it taught me something important in the hardest way possible. Not all danger looks like danger at first. Sometimes it looks like charm. Sometimes it looks like intelligence. Sometimes it looks like confidence and mystery. And sometimes it looks like someone pulling up a screen and showing you something that changes the way you see humanity forever. I walked away from that relationship alive. Shaken? Yes. Traumatized. In ways I didn't understand until much later. But alive. And I know, with absolute certainty, that it could have ended very differently. That's what stays with me. Not just what I saw on that screen, but the realization that the person sitting next to me, the one controlling what I was seeing, was capable of bringing that same darkness into my real life. And for a long time, I didn't even realize how close I was to it. I was probably too young to hear this story, but my great-grandfather told it to me anyway, in that quiet, serious way older people sometimes have when they forget how much weight their memories carry. I didn't understand everything at the time, and even now there are details I know are missing or blurred, but the core of it stayed with me. It stayed with me in a way that gave me nightmares for years, and in a way that never really left. He told me there had been a massive fire, somewhere crowded, like a bar or a nightclub. It was one of those places people went to forget their worries for a night, to drink, to laugh, to listen to music, to feel close to other people. It was packed, too packed. When the fire started, panic spread instantly. People rushed toward the exits, desperate to get out. But the doors opened the wrong way. Instead of opening outward, they opened inward. As people pressed forward, trying to escape, their own bodies became the barrier. They pushed and pushed, but the doors wouldn't open. The pressure of the crowd trapped everyone inside. Smoke filled the space. Heat became unbearable. People fell, and others fell on top of them. Many never made it out. My great-grandfather said that fire is the reason so many building codes changed afterward. It's why doors in public buildings are required to open outward now. It's why there are rules about occupancy limits, exit signage, and fire safety. Those rules weren't created out of caution alone. They were written in blood. What makes the story feel even more unreal is that my great-grandfather was supposed to be there that night. He and his friends had planned to go. They were young men then, enjoying life, blowing off steam, doing what people do when they feel invincible. But before heading out, they decided to stay in a bit longer and drink where they were. They talked, they laughed. Time slipped by. Eventually, they agreed they should finally head out. As they were on their way, they saw the smoke. At first, they didn't understand what they were seeing. Smoke like that didn't belong in the night sky. Then they heard the sirens. People were running. Someone was shouting. Reality hit them all at once. Something terrible was happening. My great-grandfather was a volunteer firefighter at the time. Without hesitation, he ran toward the fire. Not away from it, toward it. He told me this part plainly, without pride, without drama, as if it was just what had to be done. The scene was chaos. People were screaming. Smoke poured from windows. The heat was overwhelming, even from the outside. Firefighters were trying to force entry, trying to reach people trapped inside, trying to do something, anything, before it was too late. My great-grandfather ran to one of the windows. He told me he could hear a woman screaming from inside. Not words, just sound. Panic, pain, terror stripped of language. She was pressed against the window, trying to get out. He smashed the glass and reached in, grabbing her with both hands, pulling with everything he had. For a moment, he thought he was saving her. Then he realized something was wrong. He told me that only part of her came out. He didn't describe it in detail, and I'm grateful for that now. But the meaning was clear enough. The crowd inside, the pressure, the heat, the damage already done, had made it impossible for her to be pulled free. Her body had been pinned, crushed, and damaged beyond what a child should ever imagine. He let go. Not because he wanted to, because there was nothing else he could do. I remember him stopping when he told that part, his voice going quiet. I don't remember him crying, but I remember the silence. The kind of silence that carries more weight than the words ever could. After that, I wasn't allowed story time with my great-grandfather anymore. The adults decided I was too young, and they were right. I was. That image planted itself in my mind and grew there, feeding my nightmares. For years, I dreamed of crowds pressing forward, of doors that wouldn't open, of smoke filling my lungs while people screamed around me. Even though I hadn't been there, my brain treated the story like a memory. As I got older, I learned more about that fire. I learned that it was the Coconut Grove nightclub fire in 1942, one of the deadliest nightclub fires in American history. Nearly 500 people died. Many of them were young. Many of them had gone out that night expecting nothing more than music and drinks. I learned that the doors opening inward were just one of many failures. Flammable decorations, blocked exits, overcrowding, a building designed for comfort, not safety. Every small decision stacked on top of the next until disaster became inevitable. And I learned that people like my great-grandfather carried those memories for the rest of their lives. He had been in the Navy during World War II. Later, when I was older, I heard some of those stories too. Stories of ships burning, of men lost at sea, of things no one should have to see. But the fire story stayed with me the most. Maybe because it wasn't war. It wasn't distant or abstract. It was a place like any other place, a bar, a club, somewhere people went to feel alive. The most disturbing part, even now, is how close he came to being inside that building. If he and his friends hadn't stayed in to drink a little longer, he might have been one of the people pressing against those doors, one of the people trapped in the crush, one of the names on a long list read aloud later. Instead, he was on the outside, trying to pull people free and carrying the memory of those he couldn't save. That kind of near miss changes a person. I think that's why he told me the story, even if he shouldn't have. I think he wanted someone to know, to understand that life can turn on something as small as deciding to leave 10 minutes later. That safety rules aren't annoyances, that crowds can become deadly, that fire doesn't care how happy you were moments before. As a child, I didn't have the language for any of that. I just had the images my mind created and the fear that came with them. As an adult, I understand more, but it doesn't make the story easier. If anything, it makes it heavier. Every time I push open a door in a public place and it swings outward, I think about that fire. Every time I see an exit sign, I think about the people who didn't make it to one. Every time a building feels too crowded, I feel a flicker of unease that I can't fully explain to anyone else. That's the legacy of stories like this. They don't end when the fire is put out. They don't end when the bodies are removed. They live on in building codes, in quiet instincts, in generational warnings passed down in fragments. They live on in nightmares told too early, in memories carried too long. My great-grandfather lived a long life after that night. He raised a family. He laughed. He worked. But I know that window never left him. That moment of pulling with all his strength and realizing it wasn't enough. That sound of screaming that didn't turn into relief. I was too young to hear it. But I'm glad I remember it, because it reminds me that some of the most important rules we live by were written after unimaginable loss, and that sometimes survival comes down to nothing more than staying in for one more drink and seeing smoke instead of music when you finally step outside. I was 18 years old when my life split cleanly into a before and an after, even though I didn't understand that at the time. My sister was 17. We were young, barely adults, trying to do what people always tell you to do at that age, survive, figure things out, and protect the people you love with whatever strength you think you have. We didn't know yet how fragile that illusion was, or how quickly familiarity could turn into violence. At the time, we had a roommate named Joe Heinzler. He lived with us, and from the outside, everything probably looked normal enough. But underneath that, there was tension that kept building. Joe was deeply infatuated with my sister in a way that went far beyond harmless interest. It was obsessive, uncomfortable, the kind of attention that feels wrong even when you can't fully explain why. His best friend, Justin Norcutt, was the same way with me. There was something unsettling about how intensely focused he was, how he watched, how he spoke, how he seemed to think closeness was something he was owed rather than something given. We tried to coexist. We tried to keep the peace. That's what young people do when they don't yet realize that some situations can't be managed safely. Everything came to a head when my sister found out that Joe had brought 3 pounds of marijuana into our home. She had a 2-year-old daughter. That was her line. There was no debate, no compromise. She kicked him out immediately. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't cruel. It was protective. She was a mother first, and she wasn't going to gamble her child's safety for anyone. That decision flipped a switch. Joe had taken some of my sister's work clothes when he left and left behind his Nike bag. At first, it was framed as a simple exchange. He wanted his bag back. She wanted her clothes back. I tried to act as a mediator, thinking this was just tension that needed calm voices and clear boundaries. I still believed people could be reasoned with. Then the threats started. Not vague anger, not insults, threats against my niece's life. The moment those words were spoken, something inside me went cold. Whatever discussion we thought we were having ended instantly. You don't negotiate with someone who threatens a child. The call ended abruptly. We locked the door. We thought we had done enough. We were wrong. Less than 10 minutes later, there was a knock at our front door. It wasn't loud at first, but it wasn't friendly either. When I looked through the window, I saw people I didn't recognize. 2 women I had never seen before. A man I didn't know. And Justin. My heart dropped. The door was locked. That didn't matter. They forced their way in, ripping the door completely off its frame. Wood shattered. The frame split. The sound was violent and final, like something breaking that could never be repaired. I froze. Not because I didn't want to move, but because my body didn't know how. Terror does that. It locks you in place while your mind races. I knew in that moment that these people were not there to scare us. They wanted us dead. My sister reacted faster than I did. She ran into the bathroom and called the police. I will never forget the sound of her voice, shaking but determined, as she told the dispatcher what was happening. That call saved our lives. Justin moved through the living room like he owned it. A friend of ours was there with us that day. Justin attacked him viciously, knocking out 4 of his front teeth without hesitation. There was no warning, no argument, just violence. Then Justin ran toward my sister's room, searching for my niece. If my niece had been home that day, I don't think any of us would have survived. The other 3 came straight to my room. They didn't yell. They didn't threaten verbally. They just started hurting me. The 2 women beat me with broken pieces of the door frame, boards that still had construction nails in them. Their goal wasn't random harm. They were trying to permanently disfigure my face. To leave marks I would never escape. The man stood there with a gun pointed at me, silent, watching. I remember the floor. I remember the walls. I remember thinking with strange clarity that this was how people died. Not in dramatic movie moments, but in chaos, confusion, and pain. surrounded by people who had once been part of your life. To this day, I still have permanent dents in my skull from that beating. They never healed completely. My body remembers even when my mind tries to forget. At some point, my sister screamed out that she had called the police. That single sentence changed everything. The two men ran. Panic finally broke through their confidence. My sister burst into my room, and together we fought for our lives until the two women decided to flee as well. When it was over, the house was destroyed, our bodies were broken, and nothing felt real. Later, we learned what they had planned to do. They were going to beat us, rape us, and then kill us. See, knowing that changes how you see the world forever. The worst part isn't just the violence, it's what came after. They got away with it. The police refused to even question Justin. The only person who saw him enter our home was our friend, the same one whose teeth Justin had knocked out. We had heard Justin. We recognized his voice. We knew he was there. But because we hadn't seen him with our own eyes in that moment, the police dismissed it. Our friend was too terrified to speak. Justin threatened to kill him and his entire family if he told anyone what he saw, and the police did nothing to protect him, nothing to reassure him, nothing to make it safe for him to tell the truth. So silence won. To this day, Justin is still out there, free, living his life. Joe is also free, apparently married now, with children of his own, living what looks like a happy, normal life after orchestrating an attack meant to end ours. That reality is harder to live with than the scars. People like to believe that justice is automatic, that if something terrible happens, the system will step in, investigate, protect, and punish. That belief shatters the moment you realize how easily violence can be erased by fear, technicalities, and indifference. We didn't get closure. We didn't get accountability. We didn't get to feel safe again for a very long time. What we got was survival. Survival sounds like a victory until you understand what it costs. The hypervigilance, the mistrust, the way loud noises make your body react before your brain can catch up, the way you scan rooms instinctively, the way you never fully relax around people who show obsession or entitlement. I learned, I'm far too young, that the most dangerous people are often the ones you already know, the ones who feel rejected, the ones who believe affection is owed, the ones who confuse desire with ownership and rage with justice. I also learned how fragile safety really is, and how quickly a normal day can turn into a fight to stay alive. That day never leaves me. It shaped who I became, how I protect myself, how I protect others. And every time I think about the fact that those people are still out there, walking free, blending into ordinary life, I feel that same cold weight in my chest. Not fear anymore, just the quiet, permanent knowledge that monsters don't always look like monsters, and sometimes they never face consequences at all. Kitty Genovese was a young woman trying to live an ordinary life. She worked hard, kept to a routine, and like many people, she ended her days by traveling home late at night. There was nothing unusual about that evening. It was quiet, calm, and familiar. The streets she walked were ones she knew well, paths she had taken countless times before. She had no reason to believe that this night would be any different from all the others. As she made her way home from work, she didn't realize that someone had noticed her. A man began following her from a distance. At first, there was no obvious sign of danger, no sudden movement, no raised voice, no confrontation. just footsteps behind her, steady and patient, blending into the quiet of the night. She kept walking, unaware that she was being watched, that her routine had been observed, and that someone had already made a decision about her fate. When she reached the area near her apartment building, the man closed the distance between them. In a matter of seconds, everything changed. Without warning, he attacked her from behind and stabbed her twice in the back. The pain was immediate and overwhelming. Shock took hold before fear even had time to fully register. Kitty screamed. She screamed that she had been stabbed. She screamed for help. She screamed for someone, anyone, to come outside and save her. Her voice echoed through the night, cutting through the silence and reaching the windows of nearby apartments. Lights flicked on. Curtains moved. People woke up. Someone from one of the apartments shouted out, telling the man to leave her alone. That single interruption was enough to make the attacker panic. He stopped and ran off, disappearing into the darkness. For a moment, it must have felt like it was over, like the worst had passed, like help would come any second now. Kitty was badly injured, but she was still alive. She tried to get up. She tried to move away from where she had been attacked, dragging herself toward what she hoped would be safety. She believed that someone had heard her, that someone had already called the police, that sirens would be on their way. But no one came. Minutes passed. 10 long, painful minutes. No police, no ambulance, no footsteps rushing to her side. In that time, the attacker returned. He came back slowly, cautiously, checking the area to see if anyone was around. He didn't see police lights. He didn't hear sirens. He didn't see people outside. What he saw was silence, opportunity, a wounded woman alone in the dark. He found Kitty a short distance away from where the first attack had happened. She was weak, injured, and terrified. And this time, there was no one to shout at him. No voice from a window, no interruption. He stabbed her again, and again. This time, he did not stop. After killing her, he raped her. Then he went through her belongings and stole money from her wallet, as if her life was nothing more than a crime scene to be emptied. When it was over, he left her there to die. What makes this story so deeply unsettling is not only the violence of the attack, but everything that happened around it. Or more accurately, everything that didn't happen. Over the course of the incident, more than 35 people heard Kitty's screams. They heard her say she had been stabbed. They heard her begging for help. They heard the fear in her voice. And not one of them called the police. Some watched from their windows. Some listened from their beds. Some assumed the situation had already been handled. Others didn't want to get involved. Many later said they thought someone else must have already called for help. That assumption cost a woman her life. Later, psychologists and researchers would give this behavior a name, the bystander effect. It describes how people are less likely to help someone in danger when others are present, because responsibility feels shared. Everyone assumes someone else will step in. And when everyone thinks that way, no one does anything. In Kitty's case, that effect played out in the most tragic way possible. More than 35 people heard her suffering, but each person believed they were not the one who needed to act. Each person waited for someone else to make the call. By the time the police were finally contacted, it was far too late. Her murder sparked outrage and disbelief. People struggled to understand how so many could hear such clear cries for help and do nothing. Newspapers covered the case extensively. Public conversations erupted about personal responsibility, urban life, and how easily people can become disconnected from one another. Kitty was no longer just a victim of murder. She became a symbol, a painful example of what happens when fear, indifference, and assumptions take over in moments where action is needed most. For her family, none of the explanations mattered. No psychological theory could make sense of the loss. No research term could soften the reality of what she endured. Their daughter, their sister, their loved one had been alone when she needed help the most, surrounded by people who could hear her but didn't come. The story left a lasting mark on society. It changed how emergency calls were handled. It influenced how people were taught to respond to cries for help. It forced communities to confront uncomfortable truths about human behavior. But at the center of it all was a young woman walking home from work, expecting nothing more than to unlock her door and go to sleep. Her life ended not just because one man chose violence, but because dozens of others chose silence. Even now, decades later, her story still raises difficult questions. Would things be different today? Would people react faster? Would someone step outside? Would someone pick up the phone? The truth is uncomfortable. We like to believe we would do the right thing, that we would act, that we would help. But Kitty's story reminds us how easy it is to hesitate, to assume, to stay still, and how sometimes that hesitation can be deadly. Her name is remembered not only because of what was done to her, but because of what wasn't done for her. Because her final moments exposed something fragile and troubling about human behavior. Something that still matters, still applies, and still asks the same question every time someone cries out for help. Who will be the one to act? When I was around 14 or 15 years old, my world was still small in the way it is when you're that age. Everything important existed within a few miles of home. School, friends, familiar roads, and the places we went when we wanted to feel free for a few hours. Back then, fear didn't really feel real. It was something you experienced in movies or during a bad dream that faded once you woke up. I didn't yet understand how certain moments can stay with you forever. Near where I lived, there was an old abandoned farm. It had been empty for years, long before my friends and I ever thought about going there. I knew the place well. My dad and I had moved to the area about 10 years earlier, and even back then the farm was already deserted. No people, no animals, no lights at night. Just a farmhouse and a small shed sitting quietly in the middle of nowhere. To us, it was the perfect place to hang out. Like most boys that age, we were drawn to places we weren't supposed to be. We didn't go there with bad intentions. We weren't breaking things or stealing anything. We just wanted a place that felt like it belonged to us, somewhere away from adults and rules. A place where we could laugh too loud, talk nonsense, and feel grown up without actually being grown up. That day felt no different from any other. The sun was still up when we got there, and the air was calm. No wind, no strange sounds, just the quiet that comes with open land. The farmhouse looked exactly the way it always had. Weathered wood, broken windows, paint peeling away in long strips. The shed sat a short distance away, leaning slightly, like it had given up trying to stand straight years ago. We walked around, joked with each other, kicked rocks, explored rooms we had already seen a dozen times before. Everything felt normal, comfortable even. There was no sense of being watched, no strange feeling in the air. If anything, it felt peaceful in that empty, forgotten way. We were completely sure we were alone. The farm wasn't big. There wasn't anywhere someone could hide without us noticing. No nearby houses, no roads close enough for someone to wander over without being seen. Just fields, trees, and silence. We would have noticed another car, another person, anything out of place. We always did. After a while, we decided to head home. It was starting to get later, and none of us wanted to deal with angry parents. We were laughing as we walked. still riding that careless energy you have at that age. The path away from the farm was familiar, something we'd taken many times before. That was when we heard it. At first, my brain couldn't even process the sound. It cut through the quiet so suddenly that it felt unreal. A scream. High-pitched. Sharp. It sounded like it came from a little girl, or at least something trying to sound like one. It wasn't distant. It wasn't faint. It was loud enough to stop every thought in my head all at once. We all froze for half a second. Then panic took over. None of us said a word. We didn't look back. We didn't try to figure it out. Every single one of us turned and ran. Not jogged, not hurried. We ran as fast as our legs could carry us, fueled by pure fear. My heart was pounding so hard it hurt. My breath came in short, desperate gasps. I could hear my friends behind me, their footsteps uneven, frantic. That scream didn't sound human in the way people normally scream. It wasn't like someone calling for help. It wasn't playful. It was raw and sudden, like it had been ripped out of something that shouldn't have been there at all. What terrified me most was how impossible it felt. We knew that place. We knew it was abandoned. We knew no one lived there. There were no nearby families, no children, no reason for anyone to be there, especially not a little girl. None of us had younger siblings. None of us had brought anyone else with us. We had been alone the entire time. I am still 100% sure of that, even now. The farm was in the middle of nowhere. No houses close by, no playgrounds, no roads where someone could have walked in unnoticed. The scream came from behind us, from the direction of the farm itself. There was nowhere it could have come from that made sense. We didn't stop running until we were far away. Only when the familiar sights of home started to come into view did we finally slow down. We were breathing hard, bent over, hands on our knees, trying to catch our breath. No one laughed, no one joked. The mood had completely changed. We looked at each other, wide-eyed, waiting for someone else to say something first. Did you hear that? We all nodded. Every single one of us heard the same thing. We tried to explain it away. Maybe it was an animal. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe someone was messing with us. But none of those explanations fit. Animals don't scream like that. Wind doesn't sound like a child. And there was no one around to play a prank, even if someone wanted to. Eventually, we went home. We didn't talk much about it after that. Part of it was fear. Part of it was not wanting to sound stupid. And part of it was knowing that whatever that was, we didn't want to think about it too deeply. Life moved on, school, friends, growing up. But that moment never really left me. Even now, years later, I can still hear that scream if I think about it long enough. The way it cut through the air, the way it didn't belong, the way it instantly turned a normal evening into the scariest moment of my life. I've gone back over every possible explanation in my head. I've replayed that day over and over, trying to find something we missed, some detail that would make it make sense, but nothing ever does. We were alone. The farm was abandoned. There was no one there. And yet, something screamed. That's what still scares me to this day. Not just the sound itself, but the fact that I will probably never know what made it. The unknown is far worse than any answer could ever be. Because at least an answer would give it boundaries. A shape, a reason. That scream had none of those things. It was just there. Sudden, terrifying, impossible. And sometimes late at night, when everything is quiet, I still think about it. About how quickly safety disappeared. About how something unseen can exist right outside your understanding. About how there are moments that stay with you not because you want them to, but because they refuse to let go. Whatever made that scream didn't need to chase us. It didn't need to follow us home. It only needed to remind us that we were never as alone as we thought. And that was enough. When I think back to that time, it still feels strange how clear some details are, and how completely missing others have become. I was in 6th grade, my last year of primary school. It was around 1997 or 1998, but I honestly don't remember the exact date anymore. What I do remember is how normal everything felt before it happened, and how suddenly that sense of normality disappeared. I went to a school where my mom was also a teacher. She taught 6th graders just like me, though I wasn't in her class. The 6th grade was divided into 3 groups, A, B, and C. I was in one group, my mom taught another, and over the years, I had gotten to know almost everyone across all 3. Some of those kids had been around me for the last 3 years, so even if we weren't close friends, they were familiar faces. People you nodded at in the hall, you joked with occasionally, or shared small moments with that felt unimportant at the time. At the end of every school day, I had a routine. I would wait for my mom near the entrance of the school. It was just easier that way. Teachers always stayed later than students, and I didn't mind waiting. The entrance area was usually noisy and chaotic. Kids talking, laughing, complaining about homework, parents arriving to pick their children up. It was a place full of movement and sound. The kind of environment where nothing ever really stood out. That day started the same way. I was standing near the entrance, backpack still on, waiting like I always did. But almost immediately, I noticed something was off. A lot of students from Group C were gathered together, and their energy felt completely different from usual. Instead of laughing or talking loudly, they were quiet. Some of them looked pale. A few of the girls were crying openly, wiping their faces with their sleeves, trying to comfort each other. It felt wrong, out of place. At first, I thought maybe a teacher had yelled at them, or someone had failed an exam, or there had been some kind of fight. Those things felt like big deals when you were that age. But this didn't look like that. This was heavier, deeper. I walked up to one of the guys I knew pretty well and asked him what was going on. I remember keeping my voice low, like I already knew the answer wasn't going to be something small. "Hey, man," I asked, nodding toward the group. "What happened to them?" He looked at me in a way I had never seen before. His face was serious, almost empty, like he hadn't fully processed it himself yet. Then he said it. Viridiana was killed. For a moment, my brain didn't understand the words. They just hung there in the air between us. Killed. That was something that happened in movies or on the news, not to people we knew, not to someone our age, not to a classmate. I felt this sudden, hollow shock settle in my chest. Viridiana wasn't just a name to me. She was a real person, a good classmate, someone I had seen in the hall, someone who laughed, someone who existed in the same small world I did. The idea that she was gone, that she could be gone, didn't make sense. I didn't know what to say after that. I don't think I said anything at all. I just stood there staring, trying to put together an image of her with the word killed, and failing completely. My mom came out not long after, and she could tell immediately that something was wrong. I told her what I had heard. She didn't dismiss it or tell me it was a rumor. Her face changed too. That alone made it real. That same evening, she took me to the service. I don't remember every detail of getting there. I remember the quiet. I remember adults speaking in hushed voices. I remember the feeling that I shouldn't be there. And at the same time, the feeling that I needed to be there. It was my first real encounter with death. Not an abstract idea, not a distant story. Someone I knew was gone. Seeing the casket is something that never left me. Up until that moment, death had been theoretical. Something older people talked about. Something far away. But standing there looking at the casket, knowing that Viridiana was inside, changed something in me. It made death real in a way nothing else ever had. I remember thinking how unfair it was, how she was supposed to be at school, supposed to be growing up alongside the rest of us. Instead, she was gone, and no one could explain it in a way that made sense. Later, I learned what had actually happened. Viridiana had been home alone. A couple who were related to her family had come to the house. It was the mother's godson and his wife. People who were supposed to be trusted. People who should never have been a threat. They tried to rob the house. Viridiana fought back. That part still hits me hard. The idea of her being alone, realizing something was wrong, trying to defend herself. She didn't just give up. She resisted. And for that, they killed her. But it didn't stop there. The man murdered her and then dismembered her body. He chopped her into pieces and left. Just walked away. Like what he had done was something he could escape from by simply leaving the house. Her mother came home from work later that night. I can't even begin to imagine that moment. Walking into your own home and discovering that your child has been brutally murdered. That kind of pain doesn't have words. It goes beyond grief, beyond shock, beyond anything a person should ever have to endure. When I learned those details, something inside me broke a little more. It wasn't just that she had died. It was how. It was who did it. It was the betrayal, the violence, the cruelty of it all. I was still a kid, but I understood enough to know how wrong it was, how dark, how final. That night, staring at the casket, I made a quiet promise to myself. I didn't say it out loud, and I didn't tell anyone. But I knew even then that I would never do that again. I would never look into a casket again if I could avoid it. That image was burned into my memory, and I didn't want any more like it. And I haven't. That was the last time I ever stared at a casket. Years passed. Life moved on in the way it always does. School ended, people grew up. New memories formed over old ones. But that experience never fully faded. It stayed with me, tucked away, surfacing when I least expected it. What struck me most, even as time went on, was how quickly innocence disappeared. One day, we were kids worrying about homework and friendships. The next, we were confronted with something horrifying and irreversible. It forced us to understand, far too early, that the world isn't always safe, and that evil doesn't always come from strangers hiding in the dark. Sometimes it comes from people you're supposed to trust. Viridiana's death changed the way I looked at everything after that. It made me more aware of how fragile life really is, how quickly it can be taken, how unfair it can be. I still think about her from time to time, about who she might have become, about the life she never got to live. She was just a girl, a classmate, someone who should still be here. Whenever I remember that day at school, the crying, the silence, the shock on everyone's faces, it feels like a line was drawn between before and after. Before that moment, death was distant. After that moment, it was real. And no matter how much time passes, that feeling never fully goes away. Rest in peace, Viridiana. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, Just real stories about real people who survived things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.